Hello, Real Vision. My name is Quinton Mathews. I am the managing member of QKM, a in-depth investigative research firm. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Jesse Eisinger. Jesse is the author of the Chickenshit Club, Why the Department of Justice Fails to Prosecute Executives. His book is a history lesson into why the United States rarely prosecutes white-collar criminals anymore, and instead has moved to a system where we largely enter no admit, no deny, deferred prosecution agreements with the corporations and leave the shareholders footing the bill for the corporate malfeasance. It's a terrific book that I found in my research really struck at the root of a number of the issues that I'm looking to dig into on this series with Real Vision, and therefore is a perfect place for us to begin our journey. So with that, Jesse, welcome.
Hi, Quinton. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Absolutely. All right, we got a lot of ground to cover, so we'll jump right in. It's my opinion, and I think it's indisputable that in many ways our society has sadly become numb to the fact that white-collar criminals get away with real serious white-collar crime. But like so many things in our life today, it didn't used to be that way. So perhaps you can start off by going through some of the eras of the SEC and the Department of Justice that you cover in your book, and give the viewers an idea of what the rule of law used to look like for corporate criminals.
Yeah, sure. Happy to do that. You know, as I say in the book, we've never had a golden age where the rich and powerful had to fear for their liberty if they committed crimes, but we've had silver ages. And I think we had a cycle, thumbnail kind of easy history of the last 120 years or so would be that we had boom, busts, and crackdowns. And of course, we had the 1929 crash. And after that, we really create the entire firmament of the securities markets corporate regulatory structure that we know today. The 1933 and 34 Securities Act creates the Securities and Exchange Commission. Eventually, we get the 1940 Investment Act. What that does is kind of invent white-collar crime. And what I mean by that is that, of course, things like embezzlement or crimes not of street crimes, not burglary or murder, were understood to be crimes, but there were other things that were completely legal, like shorting your own stock. The chairman of Chase Bank shorted his own stock into the 1929 crash. And there were all sorts of investment pools that were really stock manipulation pools. All of that was perfectly legal leading up to 1929, and that was made illegal. And so after that, there were some crackdowns, and the head of the New York Stock Exchange went to prison. Eventually, a few years later, then sort of skipping ahead very quickly, it's sort of, there's ups and downs, but we had the S&L crisis in the late 1980s. Over 1,000 executives go to prison in the wake of the investigation.
Sorry for interrupting your video, but I have an important message to share. At Real Vision, we pride ourselves on providing the very best in-depth expert analysis available to help you understand the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy. So if you like what you see on Real Vision's YouTube channel, that is just the tip of an iceberg. You should come over to realvision.com and see how we are not leaving any stone unturned, from publishing more in-depth videos, live discussions, written reports, and our latest feature, The Exchange, where you get a chance to engage with experts and fellow subscribers and learn from everyone's experience. It is an experience which you live and you learn from. So if you go to the link in the description or go to realvision.com, it costs you just $1. I don't think you can afford to be without it.
But we had the S&L crisis in the late 1980s. Over 1,000 executives go to prison in the wake of the investigations into the S&L frauds, including many of the top executives at many of the top firms. We have in the wake of the junk bond crisis and boom and bust of the 1980s, roughly around the same time, arguably the most powerful man on Wall Street at the time, Michael Milken, goes to prison, along with lawyers and other members of Wall Street firms. A partner at Goldman Sachs is frog marched off the trading room floor in handcuffs. So it's a serious crackdown. And then leading up to the NASDAQ bubble bursting, which is really a kind of stock market bubble in the late 1990s, and almost all those frauds are investigated, and individuals from almost all of the major firms involved in those are prosecuted. So you get WorldCom, Adelphia, Tyco, Global Crossing, and a variety of other smaller firms. And then, of course, the biggest and marquee prosecution there are the executives of Enron, the giant Texas trading firm. So that's my history up until the financial crisis, where after the financial crisis, which is really the biggest financial crisis since the Great Depression, we essentially get nothing. One somewhat high-level Credit Suisse banker goes to prison for actual things that were done in the wake of the financial crisis or leading up to the financial crisis that contributed to it. So one guy versus dozens and thousands in previous eras.
I think it was the chairman of the SEC, Breeden, I think during the S&L period, that said the way that we should be prosecuting white-collar criminals is to in a way that leaves them naked, homeless, and without wheels, which I couldn't agree with anymore. And out of all the stories, some people in today's world, I think the average investor is probably like me, is around 40 years old and really doesn't remember a time when people went to prison. And certainly, the idea of the president of the New York Stock Exchange going to prison is foreign. So what happened? When did it happen? What's transpired, and what are the kind of leading causes of to what it's gotten to the point where we are now?
Yeah, well, it's a complex story, and that's why I felt like it needed a book treatment, and I hope all the listeners go out and buy 2 copies. After they listen to this, they don't have to read it, but you should all buy. You're all wealthy people. So I locate the story in the last 15 years. Or so, because in the early 2000s, we did, as a country, prosecute most of the top executives, as I say, from most of the big companies. So there was a time when we could do this, and it's within living memory, and then we lost the skill set and will. So what really happened here? Why did we lose the will and ability to prosecute top corporate executives? And it actually is much worse than just not prosecuting top corporate executives. I think that, as you said in your opener, that we have a white-collar prosecution crisis, and that we don't prosecute significant white-collar criminals from huge swaths of the economy. So I was really focused in my book on large corporations and the CEOs and CFOs and chairmen and women of those corporations. But if you look at the Trump administration, I think that's revealed a much greater and deeper, more profound crisis and lack of prosecutions, a kind of under-policing and no policing of things like commercial real estate and taxation and tax fraud and corporate lobbying and campaign finance, and the list goes on. So what happened? Well, one of the major things that happened is that after that round of successful prosecutions of the Enron era, there was an enormous backlash led by the white-collar defense bar and corporations, and it depicted these prosecutions as from cowboy prosecutors. And there was a wave of a backlash in the wake of Milken, too, and this kind of built onto that. So most people think of Rudy Giuliani as having been a cowboy, and then there were cowboy prosecutions or labeled cowboy prosecutions in the wake of Enron, WorldCom, those things.
Can I ask real quickly, just so we all know what you mean, what is the defense bar, and where do they get their power, and just give a little context for the story of who we're going up against?
Sure. So what we're talking about here are the major law firms that work for corporations. They're also called white shoe law firms, and they have criminal defense departments, divisions, and they defend corporations criminally. Now, this wasn't always thus. And we're talking about firms like Sullivan and Cromwell and Debevoise and Plimpton and Davis Polk, and the list goes on and on like that. Down in Washington, D.C., you have specialist firms in D.C. like Covington and Burling and Arnold and Porter, Kirkland and Ellis. And so there are maybe 20 firms like this, Paul Weiss, that really specialize in this and are the firms that service the largest corporations. And they're giant firms. And what happened was there was an evolution in the law. And in the 1970s and really through the 1980s, these firms did not actually take on criminal work. That was kind of beneath them. It was seen as really sullying your reputation. And so they did transactional work of all kinds, M&A and the usual kind of thing for corporations. But these large law firms would, when they were confronted with a criminal investigation of some kind, would then refer to a smaller firm, a boutique firm, a set of specialists who were criminal defense lawyers, and they would take on the CEO if he had run somebody over in a car or something like that, or gotten arrested for drugs or prostitution or something like that. So that was the kind of criminal bar, and then there was the more refined kind of corporate bar. And over time that merged. And what happened was prosecutors began to focus on a higher class of criminal. And that really started happening in the 1960s and 70s. So as I was saying that, there was this kind of boom and bust cycle, but really from the 30s to the 60s, there isn't much serious white collar prosecution. And then a guy named Robert Morgenthau, very famous. People know him because he was the model for the first DA in the TV series Law and Order. And he's kind of legendary Manhattan DA. But before that, he was the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York. And the Southern District of New York is the most prestigious office of the Department of Justice, and they act almost independently, and they're the smartest and brightest and most brilliant prosecutors in the land, because they tell you they are. That's certainly according to them. And Morgenthau was a giant, and in his time, he said we should prosecute, we should go where the money is, and raise our sights, and we can't just prosecute street criminals and drug dealers on the streets, on the corner. We need to go and into the boardrooms. And he went one step further in conjunction with, or this is kind of a movement that spanned kind of the 60s and 70s, with a guy named Stanley Sporkin in the 1970s, who was arguably maybe at least the most powerful bureaucrat in Washington throughout the 70s, if not the most powerful governmental figure. And he was the head of enforcement at the SEC through most of the 70s. Eventually becomes a judge, an important judge, and he and Morgenthau before him, and then Sporkin kind of developed this theory, which they call access theory, but we call sort of gatekeepers, where they try to focus on prosecuting lawyers and accountants, with the idea, and investment bankers, with the idea that these are the entities, the people who give access to corporations to the capital markets, access to the capital markets to corporations, and are the gatekeepers, and are also kind of the first defense that the public has against criminals. And if you prosecute these people, you get some huge amount of leverage, a kind of cascading effect throughout the system. And so they really do throw some KPMG partners in prison, and lawyers, and that's, I think, an incredibly effective way of going about prosecuting white collar crime. So what's happening is, one, they're raising their sights on this, and two, what they're doing is they're prosecuting corporations as well for fraud. And these large defense firms start to realize that prosecutors are focused on them, and so they start creating white collar defense practices to kind of capture this business. It becomes kind of classier business, and it becomes a bigger business, and it becomes something that corporations have, some ongoing need for, and these large law firms want to provide, supply that need, or fulfill that need, and then what they start to do is figure out, well, who has expertise in this, and they start hiring prosecutors to be partners at these defense firms. And so you get this kind of symbiotic relationship, and it develops in tandem, where prosecutors focus more and more on corporations, the revolving door speeds up, these departments become even bigger, the divisions of these law firms become even bigger. It's an incredibly lucrative, very high margin work. And then it suddenly, slowly over time, kind of morphs into corporations becoming an arm of the government. But the dirty little secret of white collar prosecutions is that the government has outsourced and privatized it effectively. And they've outsourced and privatized it to the corporations themselves. Corporations hire these law firms, the law firms do the investigation, and then that's it. And that's no way to run a rodeo.
Yeah, and I think most general investors will understand this process, less from the prosecution side, but more from the news flow side, where a short seller or an investigative journalist will come out with research on a company about some particular malfeasance, and the board will then come in and hire the quote unquote kind of outside independent legal counsel, who, again, you've effectively outsourced the regulation to the law firm, but the law firm really is there to do what any lawyer is supposed to do, which is to protect the corporations and the people that hired them. And I think the other piece to this that actually is kind of the outcome that goes a little further is that in a investigation that's run by a regulatory body that's funded by taxpayer dollars, we have a little thing called the FOIA Act, Freedom of Information Act. And if somebody such as yourself wants to go out and find information on what happened in the investigation and what was the outcome and what was found, it may take some polling with the regulatory body, but those documents can be achieved. And of course, in these independent investigations done by the law firms, nobody ever sees those documents, and there's no way for the public to get them. So, what though was it that led the focus on the corporations versus the executives? Was it the fact that the lawyers knew that there was more money to be made by getting paid by the corporations because that's where the money is? Or was it, something kind of internally that happened at the Department of Justice and SEC that made them shy away from the executives and focus on the corporations?
Yeah, these developments are sort of coming in tandem, really, and influencing each other. So there's a lot of kind of cross-fertilization. But one of the things that happens is that in the wake of the Enron prosecutions, as I was referring to earlier. Prosecutors the government prosecuted Arthur Andersen, Enron's accounting firm, and not they prosecuted an individual, but they also charged the firm itself. And the firm, which wasn't a corporation, of course, it was a partnership at that time, was brought to trial and lost at trial, and then dissolved. Subsequently, it was people understood that the trial had put them out of business, but I think that's kind of silly and misplaced because I think the firm was going out of business anyway. Not only had they been Enron's accounting firm, but they'd also been WorldCom's, and they were facing huge lawsuits, and the partners kind of dissolved the firm to try to get ahead of that. And I think it was a fait accompli with or without the guilty plea. But subsequently, the guilty plea is overturned at the Supreme Court on something of a technicality about jury instructions. I don't think it would have really mattered. But it was never retried, and it has come to be understood by mainstream legal minds, including prosecutors, that the Arthur Andersen prosecution was a terrible mistake. And I go through that in my book. There's a chapter on the Arthur Andersen prosecution because Arthur Andersen was a handmaiden to Enron's fraud. It was incredibly enmeshed in Enron, and they were sending executives back and forth, and many Arthur Andersen partners went over to work with Enron, and Enron's accounting fraud was systemic and varied, and Arthur Andersen was there the whole way along, and Arthur Andersen also had been overseeing numerous frauds in the era, so I think it was a completely compromised, corrupt firm, worthy of prosecution. But what the Andersen PR team and firm does incredibly successfully is they changed the subject, and they changed the subject away from accounting fraud and Andersen's culpability in accounting fraud. I should mention that when Enron was being investigated, Andersen destroyed literally tons and tons of documents related to the Enron audit before the government could subpoena them. So that was the kind of obstruction of justice that they were guilty of. But what happens is they changed the subject from accounting fraud and obstruction of justice and to the collateral consequences, to the people who are who lose their jobs. Thousands and thousands of people who lose their jobs when Andersen goes out of business. Now, again, I don't think the trial put them out of business, so I don't think the trial put them out of their jobs. But this is the way it was understood, and not just understood by conservatives who pay fealty to the Wall Street Journal editorial page, but people like Lanny Brewer, who became Obama's head of the criminal division of the Department of Justice, and Mary Jo White, who became Obama's head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. They had completely imbibed this view of Andersen and that it was an excessive prosecution, cowboy prosecution. And so they decided we're going to take off prosecuting companies. We're not going to bring companies to trial and put them out of business and charge them criminally, indict companies. That's basically off the table. Nobody said that explicitly, but that was effectively what happened. And so what they did was they started to settle with corporations, and they told themselves a story about this. Prosecutors did. And the story was, we don't want to root out bad apples, and we don't want to prosecute and indict corporations because that can have these collateral consequences, these effects like we throw tens of thousands of people out of work, or if we prosecute a bank, we could start a financial crisis. That was something that really affected the way they approached prosecutions post the financial crisis in 2008. They thought the markets were so fragile that they couldn't handle prosecutions of large corporations, or especially banks, and because these are interconnected firms. So we're not going to indict. So we should try to settle, and we want to root out corruption. We don't want to just pick out bad apples. And so what they happened to do was turn toward these settlements with corporations, and they go by a variety of different names, and they have names. Prosecutors pretend that these are prosecutions. They call them deferred prosecution agreements. Sometimes they call them non-prosecution agreements. Sometimes, even recently, they've gotten guilty pleas from corporations, but they're all really the same thing. It's all a semantic issue. And really what it is they're settling with a corporation for money. And then the question is, does it work? That's the main question is, do these settlements work? Do they root out the corruption at these companies? Do they have any deterrent effect for the companies themselves or the industry or corporations writ large? And the answer is simply no, they do not. And we see this because we see recidivist corporations all the time.
There are a number of things to unpack here. The first being going back to the access theory. And I think you argue that Arthur Andersen was effectively the end of the access theory, the last major gatekeeper that got prosecuted. And to me, this is not only a travesty of prosecutions, but it's probably one of the most effective ways to actually prevent fraud itself by going after the lawyers and the accountants. And then you have this idea of too big to jail, or that you can't go after investment banks, or you can't go after the banks in the great financial crisis because the whole world is too fragile and the jobs will be lost. And I think one of the things that how I think about this is, you compare it to a larger fraud that everybody agrees with what happened. I mean, there were people who worked for Bernie Madoff and his securities firm, and those people lost their jobs. And certainly there was collateral damage that came from that. But we as a society would almost rather continue to build the house of cards, so to speak, creating ultimately larger collapses and larger frauds when they do happen. And we'd rather build those and have kind of the slow trickle down, just drain on our economy and allow this stuff to go on. And I think ultimately you somewhat argue that the individuals don't get prosecuted because these cases become so complex that you can't actually pinpoint it to the executives anymore. So you can't go after the gatekeepers because the PR that happened after Arthur Andersen. You can't go after the corporations because our whole world would fall apart if we did that. And we can't go after the executives because the businesses are too complex to go after. So we're left with a world where we have these deferred prosecution agreements, and shareholders are left holding the bag and paying for the malfeasance. And I think exactly like you say, it's clear that we're not doing a good job of deterring fraud. You can look up any day almost in the newspaper, and whether it's JP Morgan or Herbalife or Tyson Foods or these guys, almost every day there's a deferred prosecution agreement, and almost nobody's going to jail.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. Let's table the question of whether it's too complex to prosecute individual executives, particularly at high levels of corporations, for a second, because that is the crucial question, and it's an incredibly important one, and I want to have more discussion of that. But I'll say very briefly, you raise Bernie Madoff, and the question that your viewers may have is, well, or the objection they may have to my argument is, well, we did prosecute Bernie Madoff, and we also prosecuted a bunch of hedge fund managers like Raj Rajaratnam. And so what are you talking about? Well, so prosecutors know how to do certain things, and they do it over and over again. They know how to prosecute Ponzi schemes, and they know how to prosecute insider trading to some extent, although that's even now being kind of eroded by the courts to some extent. And so they do it over and over again. And why they can prosecute a hedge fund like SAC, although I do think that they were chicken shit and not going after Steve Cohn, and talk about not being deterred or not learning a lesson. This is a guy now who's going to buy the Mets. So he certainly did not pay much of a societal price for having his fund charged with being a criminal operation. But the reason why they can do that is that hedge funds are relatively discrete entities. They're actually not that interconnected financially with the rest of the economy, and they don't have that many workers generally, even a giant one like SAC. And so that's kind of viewed, at least in the back of prosecutors' minds, often this isn't really explicit, as not being too big to jail or too big to fail. That's the issue there. What's going on? Why do they have these kind of discrete prosecutions? But if you look at Madoff, what you see is when they went to prosecute the banks, like JP Morgan, that enabled Madoff, they didn't prosecute any individuals at the banks. The idea that Madoff could have survived without enormous help from mainstream financial institutions is ludicrous. And in fact, we know that many mainstream financial institutions suspected that he was a Ponzi operator, cut him off from banking at the firm and things like that. And yet JP Morgan kept on and actually ends up signing a deferred prosecution agreement. And it's quite harsh, but no individuals are charged with crimes in connection with that. So now to the question of whether it is too complex or too difficult to prosecute individuals. And I reject that entirely. What I think we are seeing is a erosion of skill set and talent and knowledge about how to prosecute them. The Department of Justice, and it's hard for prosecutors to hear this. They are extremely bright people, and they've gone, the people at the SDNY and the main justice and the elite offices of the Department of Justice have gone to the best high schools and the best colleges and the best law schools, and they're a whole hell of a lot more accomplished and smarter than I am, but they're not competent anymore institutionally. They don't know how to properly investigate, and they don't know how to properly bring the right charges, and they don't know how to win a trial. And so they're scared of all of those things and they avoid them. And the average U.S. attorney, AUSA, assistant U.S. attorney, line prosecutor in the 1970s did about 8 trials a year. Today they do fewer than 0.2 trials a year. So what we have is a complete collapse of trial expertise. And you're talking about how to surface information publicly, and maybe it comes out in FOIAs, although often that doesn't come out in FOIAs, and internal investigations don't come out at all. I completely agree with you about that. The way to really bring the public up to knowledge, bring knowledge to the public of the crimes that were committed at a corporation is to bring it to trial. That is where evidence is surfaced and challenged and adjudicated by a jury and a judge.
Hasn't that been made difficult by the Holder memo and the Thompson memo and some of the investigatory tools that the prosecutors don't have that they had during the Sporkin era?
Yes, prosecutors' tools have been stripped away, some by internal policy at the Department of Justice and some by the courts, which have taken a real libertarian turn and have had enormously sympathetic rulings toward white-collar, accused white-collar defendants and rolled back regulatory power. And the Department of Justice has taken a lot of its own powers away. Now, you're referring to the Holder memo, which becomes the Thompson memo and goes through a series of evolutions. And that is a memo that lays out how to investigate and prosecute corporations, and also when corporations deserve leniency, what they consider to be cooperation. And that all kind of changes the way corporations are approached. Corporate criminality is approached at the Department of Justice, and pushes them toward these settlements and away from prosecutions of individuals and away from indictments of corporations. And it's much, much easier to settle with a corporation for money than it is to prosecute a CEO. That will take years. The CEO will fight. There's a huge risk that they'll lose a trial. You won't have a career accomplishment. And if you rack up 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 big settlements with corporations, you're going to be very accomplished and attractive to your next employer. And what has happened at the Department of Justice, to get back to what we were talking about earlier, is that today the Department of Justice is a training ground for future corporate defense lawyers. And the government should not be a training ground for the private sector. That's a corrupt system. It's a broken system. But today what we have is people who are relatively young at the Department of Justice, very, very capable, very smart on an individual basis, with the wrong individual incentives by and large. And their incentive is to dazzle partners at law firms, and ultimately to be, seen as a very tough negotiator, but ultimately a reasonable person. And a reasonable person settles on a big settlement, but not something that's too onerous or is not a cowboy. And then those people go and become partners with the people that they were negotiating across the table with. And that's, as I say, a corrupt and broken system.
And the lawyers get their fee either way, though, I'm sure.
Yes, that's the first rule.
We've been talking about the Department of Justice. What role does the SEC play? Because I think, among my cohort of investors and people who play in the game and try to point out wrongdoing, I think that there's a general feeling that the SEC is toothless, and I don't mean that in a way that there aren't competent people there doing real work. But what happens is you get, high profile cases like Tesla and Elon Musk, where he comes out and he says he doesn't respect the SEC, and he makes, lewd comments about the chairman, and arguably commits real crimes, but nothing happens. So, do they suffer at the SEC from the same issues that the Department of Justice suffers from? And how do they feed into each other?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the SEC has been rendered a completely chicken shit operation too. And it's hard to remember an SEC chair that was feared or serious-minded about policing corporate America. Maybe you have to go back to Breeden, but it's been decades now, certainly not under Donald Trump, and unfortunately not under Obama either. The Obama record on white-collar crime is one of the great scandals of the Obama administration, in my view. And the SEC primarily would need to, the primary problem with the SEC is it's not working to help the Department of Justice prosecute securities fraud criminally. So the SEC has no criminal powers, and they do civil investigations, and they do fewer civil investigations than ever now in the Trump administration, and they're very slow and deliberative. They're doing a lot of chicken feed stuff like Ponzi schemes and pink sheet companies and bulletin board stuff and things that, small cap stocks, things that really don't matter. They do an enormous amount of insider trading, which I think of as a kind of really a kind of secondary crime, a very unimportant crime in the scheme of things. But a kind of easy to understand crime, and something that prosecutors do over and over again, and regulators do over and over again, and juries sort of understand it. And so it's kind of popular target. And so, yes, the SEC has played a terrible role in this. And I have a chapter in my book in which goes into great detail about a lawyer at the SEC who wanted to bring civil fraud charges against Goldman Sachs for their collateralized debt obligation business, and was thwarted at every turn. And at one point, an SEC official announces, internally they're discussing charges that they're going to bring against Fabrice Tour, who's the young French Goldman associate who ends up being charged by the SEC, the only one at the SEC who's charged by the SEC, only one at Goldman for CDOs. And this SEC guy sends an email around saying, remember, these are good people who've made one bad mistake. And that's good people who've made one bad mistake. And I think that is a endemic problem with the way our regulators and prosecutors see white collar criminals as fundamentally good, fundamentally of our class. There's an enormous amount of elite affinity here. These people are articulate and well-educated and tasteful, and they just can't be criminals. And they are quite well-educated and quite tasteful and very erudite in many ways and articulate. And many of them are just criminals at heart. And the problem with that ethos, that they're good people who've made one bad mistake, is one, you just don't know if they're good people or not. Maybe they're just bad people. Maybe Goldman Sachs or McKinsey hires a lot of people who are rotten to the core and have terrible values and don't care about paying attention to the rules. I think that that's very plausible. But the second thing is, how do you know that this was a mistake? Maybe this was done on purpose. And how do you know that it was one? It was the one that you got caught with, but that doesn't mean that it's one bad mistake. So that, as a matter of logic, it's a terrible way to approach your job. And it's something that makes them go soft.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things that good short sellers do in looking for companies to investigate is to follow bad actors around. And one, birds of a feather flock together. And two, oftentimes, because these guys are not being put away, they go from, one fraud and they disappear for a couple of years and they come up at another fraud, and it's fertile grounds to look because these people generally do not change. And you would think that you would have somewhat of the same investigatory tactics at the SEC by saying, look, if Goldman or McKinsey hire these people and they're doing wrongdoing, then there's probably other people that are doing wrongdoing around there because it's a culture of it. And we saw that with Arthur Andersen. And again, unfortunately, we've lost a lot of that. And also, it seems that it used to be that the way that they would investigate these companies is they would start down with the lower. You would, like, moving up through the mafia, right? You'd start with the capo and you'd move up. And the way to go through a complex investigation was to get the details from down low and move up to the boss. In fact, I think somewhere in your book, there was a prosecutor that used to do mafia cases, and he says, it's bullshit. If I can go out and do international drug cartels and get to the boss, and you guys can figure out, what the head of the bank is doing, right? And whether he knew. So we've moved to that, to now where the young guys are no longer used to get the executives, they're used as sacrificial lambs. And they're thrown, and so you get your fee, you get your sacrificial lamb, and the executives get to essentially move on.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is what I mean when I talk about a lost skill set and a bad investigative approach, is that they do not invest the time and resources into flipping the low-level people and working their way up the chain. And that's also why I reject the idea that these are too complex or that these investigations are more difficult to do than they were in the past, because cartel investigations are extremely complex and everything is hidden. And the Enrons of the world were extremely complex. And there was nothing written down. Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling had no emails. And so what you needed to do was focus on prosecuting individuals and nailing them for crimes, and then putting them in the witness chair and having them say, I committed a crime, and look at the jury and say, I am guilty, and I did it with that guy sitting right there. And the other thing that they need to do is focus on simple stories. And the simple story of the prosecution of Ken Lay especially was lies and truth. He was saying one thing in public and another thing in private, and doing one thing in public and doing another thing in private. So they didn't get into arcane debates about whether the off-balance sheet vehicles were illegal or not, and whether they'd sold off their right percentage or not, and all of those kind of all that accounting arcana and securities law arcana that really the defense wanted to get into, they eschewed that entirely. And that was a very effective trial. So the problem is, one of the problems is that we need to restore the skill set here. And that means that they've got to go to trial more and they've got to lose more. And the whole point of the title of the Chickenshit Club comes from a Jim Comey line, that Jim Comey, but this is when he was back in the head of the SDNY in the early 2000s, and he gathers all these prosecutors together and he says, how many of you have never lost a case? And a bunch of hands shoot up, and he says, well, we call you the Chickenshit Club because you're taking on, the easy pickings, the low-hanging fruit. And what you need to do, your job is not about racking up a record with no losses, an undefeated record. Your job is to do justice. And justice requires taking on the most ambitious cases and the most significant wrongdoers. And if sometimes you lose, justice still has been served.
The big question is, how do we do it, right? Is it as easy as getting the right leadership in? Or, I guess if you had a magic wand and you could make 3 or 4 or 5 things happen that you think would be effective in causing immediate change, or maybe not immediate, but long-lasting change, and getting the departments and the regulatory bodies aimed back in the right direction, what would those changes be?
Yeah, there's no immediate changing this. This is an enormous crisis where the institutions of our government have been under attack for decades, and a restoration project for the federal government's regulatory apparatus is going to take years and years and billions of dollars. One thing you need to do is invest in the IRS. And my colleague Paul Keel and I have a series of stories at ProPublica called Gutting the IRS, and I encourage people to read them. Billions have been taken out of the budget, and tens of thousands of employees at the IRS have left, and audits have collapsed, and criminal referrals have collapsed, and criminal referrals of tax fraud almost don't exist anymore, which is kind of mind-boggling. But the IRS mainly, when it prosecutes tax fraud criminally, is attaching itself to ongoing prosecutions of money laundering or drug cartels and things like that. But they're not really prosecuting people who have legal income and yet cheat on their taxes. That almost doesn't exist anymore. As I say, audits of the wealthy have collapsed, audits of corporations have collapsed. And today, if you make less than $20,000, if you're a member of the working poor, your chances of being audited are greater than if you make $500,000. Your chances of being audited are about the same as if you're in the 1%. And so that's where the IRS. So we need a reclamation project for the IRS, and it'd probably take a decade and multiple billions of dollars of hiring and training and people learning to audit the wealthy. You need a reclamation project for the SEC and the entirety of the EPA and OSHA and the FTC and the antitrust division of the Department of Justice, and on and on. And then you would need to, you need to invest in government.
And the restorations, I know they're full encompassing and there's not just one thing, but are these, is it just putting more money in? Is it fixing a problem of the revolving door?
Right.
What is let's tackle the Department of Justice and or the SEC and what are a handful of things that a restoration looks like?
So after you have that, then what you need to do, let's just take the DOJ since this is a complex issue. But then what I would do is completely throw out settlements with corporations and use them only as a very last resort and totally orient toward prosecuting individuals. Individuals create crimes, pieces of paper that say, we're a corporation, do not commit crimes. And so what I would do is reorient entirely to focusing on prosecuting individuals, and then try to incentivize individual prosecutors to conduct those investigations and trials. not relying on the internal investigations conducted by the handpicked law firms, corporations who handpick their law firms. And I would pay these prosecutors a lot more money so that many of them would want to stay. I think a lot of people like being a prosecutor. And if we could keep them, more of them as lifers to have some kind of institutional knowledge, I think that would end up being a good thing. You want a little bit of revolving doors so that there's some skill set. But mainly what I would do is have the DOJ recruit totally differently. Instead of recruiting bright young things from the elite law schools and the top law firms who are very young and energetic and in their 20s, I would recruit away from the elite law schools. So, that's the top 50 law schools rather than the top 5. I want people who are in consumer protection law and class action lawyers and defense attorneys who are refugees from big law, who don't want to go back, who know where the bodies are buried, and all sorts of public interest lawyers, academics, people like that. So I would want an enormous amount more diversity in the ranks of prosecutors, professional diversity, age diversity, experiential diversity, breaking the hold of these elite law schools. And then there needs to be much more policy thinking. The Department of Justice is a really strange bureaucracy, and it's essentially all these discrete offices that act quasi-independently of each other. And what you need is some overarching policy thinking to say, what are the statutes that have been rolled back over the last decade, 15 years by the judiciary, and where do we need to pound the legislature, pound Congress to restore some of these powers and get some of these statutes back so that we can take on these criminals. As it is, the courts are in the process of making white-collar crime and political corruption legal in this country. And if the legislature and prosecutorial ranks don't address this statutorily, they're going to have no powers left.
What do you think the hope of getting the access theory back and being able to prosecute the gatekeepers? You can't. The funny thing is every fraud that's ever been perpetrated, by a public company has had audited financials, right? So It's all the proof that you need that the auditors there, either their job is not to detect fraud, which I really think is the issue, but to some degree that they clearly allow it to happen. So is that a lost cause, or how do we get the gatekeepers back as the frauditeurs?
I think that there is beginning to be some broad recognition of the problem of the lack of white-collar prosecutions. I think the Trump administration has thrown this problem into great relief since it's the most corrupt administration we've had since since Teapot Dome or something. And so a lot of it depends on who's elected. If Trump is elected, then I think we see something much worse than what we have already. We didn't even talk about the collapse of the DOJ under the Trump administration and how that's really challenged the rule of law and how they're eroding the rule of law in this country and creating a DOJ that doesn't just not prosecute people, but actually has become a weapon to persecute enemies of Trump and a shield to protect his friends. And that is that attacks the very core of our society and the rule of law. So more of that if Trump is reelected. And if Biden is elected, then I think that there's a possibility that we would get an actual kind of beginnings of a restoration of the regulatory state and prosecution. But I don't particularly see the administration making this a priority. They're going to have a lot of other priorities. The Obama administration, of which Biden was a part, obviously, was incredibly weak on white-collar prosecution. So it depends on who Biden appoints these various roles. I think there's going to be a battle within the soul of the Democratic Party because there are reformists, like the Warren people, and then there are kind of the conservative corporate Dems who are not particularly interested in this, and we'll have to see. I'm pretty skeptical that a Biden administration would really kind of lead to much turnaround here.
Yeah, well, one of the broader implications that I see, and we, given our different jobs, approach or kind of see the outcomes of your research leading to different conclusions. But to me, being able to go after the gatekeepers is important for two reasons. One, it's a fraud deterrent. But two, what I see in my line of work is that the lawyers and the law firms are not only, the home now of regulation. We've outsourced the regulation. But in many instances, they now get used by the corporations as hitmen. And what I mean by that is large name frauds like Wirecard and MiMedx. Those companies and others like them have wielded enormous power to ruin the lives of people who have tried to blow the whistle on the malfeasance at these companies. And I don't think most of the investing public is aware, that whistleblowers have their homes broken into, their phones and computers hacked, their children and, families, pictures being taken and put up on the internet. And I find in my work that much of that can be drawn back to the law firms that we've outsourced this regulation to. So, to me, the ability to get the gatekeepers, however we can do that, is a huge problem that you point out in your book. And again, one of the reasons I think it's such a fascinating read and such an important read. And I'm glad that we could bring attention to it in the proper way to the financial community here on Real Vision. And I guess before we leave, we're coming up on the hour here. I'm going to try to end each one of these interviews that I do by asking, where should I go next on my journey, right? So do I talk to ex-SEC guys? Do I, where do we go to learn more, to dig deeper about what the problem is and ultimately how we can fix it?
Well, that's a good question. I think that there are a series of reform-minded young policy people, not young and not so young policy folks in Washington right now, or having come from Washington, and they have a lot of bright ideas about this. So you have a lot of Warren acolytes. Jennifer Taub is a law professor who's got a new book out, which everybody should read on white collar crime, called Big Dirty Money. I have it right here. And there's a guy, Graham Steele, out of Stanford, who worked on the Hill a long time, and Amanda Fisher, who works at a think tank in Washington. And and so there are a variety of people who are thinking about these issues of how to regulate. And then there's, of course, a very interesting antitrust movement being led by intellectuals like Lena Khan and Matt Stoller. I'm leaving out a bunch of different names, but so there is a kind of a burgeoning ferment under the surface to bring back tax enforcement and antitrust enforcement and securities law enforcement. And if they happen to get a foothold in the next administration, they're going to have a lot of chance to influence and change things and reform things. We'll have to see.
That's great. Jesse, appreciate your time. Fascinating. If you haven't read the book, it's an absolute must read. And maybe we can get you on some other time to dig into post-Trump election and see where we are.
Well, we'll have to see. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it.
You bet.
Thank you for watching this interview. This is just a taste of what we do at Real Vision. To learn more about the complex world of finance, business, and the global economy, click on the membership link in the description. Give us 7 days to change your life. This will be the best dollar you ever invest.